It's time to get going on player season previews. Let's take a look at the power forwards-ish on the Pacers roster's upcoming season. A big question, what their role could be. Best case and worst case scenarios. We're starting with Obi Toppin, Jarace Walker, and Jalen Smith on today's Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today we are starting the player season preview series, and just like the season recap series, all of them are going to be with Caitlin Cooper from Basketball She Wrote. Really good in-depth analysis on every player, looking ahead this time instead of looking back. And today we start with the power forwards, three guys: Jarace Walker, Obi Toppin, and we had to fit someone else in the third spot, Jalen Smith. If you're wondering why it's not Jordan Nwora, because he had to be in the small forwards episode. It's all going to work out in the end, but we take a look at all three players under the guise of their role, a big question about their season, and the best and worst case scenario, what it means for them now, what it means for the Pacers long term, how will it all play in to this upcoming season where the Pacers would like to win but are still trying to develop. Really good conversation about all three of these guys. Lots of in-depth stuff. Let's just get right into it. In less than a month, the Indiana Pacers will be playing preseason basketball games. In about 3 weeks, they'll have training camp start. It's time to dive into the 2023-24 Indiana Pacers. And the best way to do that, to me, is player season previews. And who better to do that with than the person that we recapped to every single player's season just 4 months ago? It's Caitlin Cooper. Instead of looking back like we did last time, we're looking forward now. We have new information about who's on the team, what they think of their roles because of what they said on an NBA Finals broadcast, for example, and many other pieces of information that we can use in these discussions. Caitlin, the World Cup is over. We have a month without men's basketball. What are you going to do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to dig into these previews, Tony. There's a lot of work for us to do here. We got a lot of players to get through. I was actually a little bit worried. I told you this before we hopped on. When you first asked me, I'm like, is that whole series going to be repetitive? Are people going to get sick of me over on his YouTube channel if we do 15 more of these? But I don't think that they're going to, because now that we have the full picture, we know who's on the team, we have more that we can look at and differentiate from what we did at the end of the season.
Yeah, we've got four new players we can do. We've got role clarity. We've got team goal clarity. There's a lot more to dig into, especially because this year's goals are now more known, whether they'll be really going for it or kind of going for it, and how much that will matter to their long-term future. And that might sneak its way into some of my questions about many of these players. We'll start with the guy that they acquired first this offseason. I should say today's show's all power forwards, although we had to sneak in a third power forward somehow.
He played power forward once.
He did play power forward last year. Well, we kind of had to get creative in general because Jordan Nwora is in the threes group and Jalen Smith is in the fours group. Although Jordan Nwora told me a few weeks ago that he's trying to cut weight to play more positions. So this all works to me. Jalen Smith is started at the four last year, so he's in this group. So today it's Jalen Smith and then the two obvious fours of Jarace Walker and Obi Toppin. And like I said, we'll start with the guy they acquired first, Jarace Walker. The way we'll do these is looking at what their role could or should be, one big question about their season, and the best and worst case scenario for their year. And I actually have to start with my question about Jarace Walker, Caitlin, because a lot of my best case, worst case, and role stuff relate to this question. And that is, Jarace Walker, what can you do reliably on offense in the NBA? Right? I am curious what that will look like because, going back when I talked to his IMG coaches, he played a lot of positions there. He played some point guard, he played center, he played on the wing even, and that was obviously high school, but he has a little bit of experience coming up doing a lot of stuff. At Houston, he did some playmaking, he did some pick and pop, he kind of rolled sometimes, but not that much. He's an okay passer, but not the greatest shooter and not a high volume creator. Like, what is he going to be in the pros, right? Can he be any sort of creator? Is he going to be some sort of shooter type? Is he just going to plug in a lot of gaps and move the ball really well and make smart decisions and set screens? There's a lot of stuff he can be good at. I want to know what they are because it matters a lot on how I project him with the Pacers and where he makes the most sense with his role.
Yeah, I think that would have been, if I had been assigned to Jarace, my big question would have been, what is he as well? Is he more of a 3-4, a power wing? Is he more of a 4-5, a tweener big? And Summer League wasn't super illuminating as to providing answers on that front because his role was affected by the fact that Andrew wasn't out there, that they didn't really have a table setter. That pushed him into having to do more quote unquote point forward, point Jarace Walker things that I don't necessarily think we're going to be seeing on a larger sample once he's out there in lineups that potentially include both of TJ McConnell and Andrew Nembhard, or one of TJ McConnell and Andrew Nembhard, where this offense pretty much runs through the guard positions for the most part. I do think it's possible that we might see him like get a rebound and push the ball on certain occasions. Maybe for specific matchups, we might see, a 4-5 pick and roll sighting here or there, like what we saw in the OKC game and the Dallas game. I mean, I still think that I tend to lean toward, and it was unfortunate because we didn't get to see a lot of it. I think I lean toward him more as a big, more doing, and it's not even me necessarily making a player comp, and I don't want to set an unrealistic bar for him, but doing things like what Draymond Green does within Golden State's offense, where you can see Jarace using fake handoffs and operating through the middle third of the floor closer to the basket rather than having to rely so much on his shot to hit at a high clip and being able to attack closeouts, being able to facilitate maybe out of the short roll. He only finished one shot as the roll man at Summer League, and he only finished, I think, a total of 3 when he was at Houston, and that just wasn't really possible because Isaiah Jackson was on the roster for 2 games. Oscar Tshiebwe was on the roster for 2 games. Obviously, they were going to be the people tethered and moving toward the basket in those lineups. And when he was at the 5, sometimes they were still using him as the ball handler for the reasons that we said. They didn't really have a table setter. So I still think that there's a lot unknown about him. So that's a good question for you to have asked.
And a funny thing about what you just said, too, is for him to do some of the stuff that I would be interested in, playing next to a spacing big could matter. And so Jalen Smith, who we'll talk about later, like his role could be tethered or related to what Walker is or isn't doing, because there could be spacing issues with some other reserve bigs, and that'll come up in the center episode, certainly. But, that is it. Like if he's out there and the big is Isaiah Jackson, and Isaiah Jackson setting a screen and running a pick and roll with whoever the point guard is, like what's Jarace going to do? Is he even guarded? Like, how's that going to work? What's that going to look like for the Pacers? I have no feel for him as a shooter. Like, it was okay at Houston, and then he had an elbow injury in Summer League that I kind of just throw that out because of small sample size normally anyway. So now I have 2 reasons to not even cite that stat ever in my life ever again. So I have no idea what he's going to be as a shooter in the pro level, but making him a spot-up guy seems silly given what he's good at, and he can make smart, quick decisions and read the game well. So I'll be curious how they use him, what that looks like, and really – I kind of want to know, as like a subset of that question, do you have skills that let you succeed without Tyrese Halliburton on the floor? Because that will also matter when I project out what he could be.
Well, yeah, because I mean, that's the big one headed into camp. I'm sure you're going to get to with the role is Jarace Walker a starter next year? Is he going to be playing behind Obi Toppin, and how much does that impact him? And I like that you bring up the idea with Isaiah Jackson, because that was kind of my thought process when we saw him at Summer League, is that it was unfortunate that there was no other floor spacing big really on that roster to ever play him with, to be able to see if he could do more things as a screener than, because we never really got to see him at the short roll in those 4 games. We never got to see him even as the roll man going clear to the basket in those 4 games. So that brings up an interesting question. Like you said, with Jalen Smith, Jalen did not shoot the ball well last year, but he does in fact shoot. Or, we will get to that today. Even gold medalist Daniel Tice, he shoots on occasion too. So I do think that what's going to be best with each person in that bench lineup, if we're just to assume right now that Jarace would come off the bench, who is Andrew going to pair with? I think better is going to be different than who Jarace might pair with better, and how you prioritize and balance those things, I think could be a little bit like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube.
There's a pattern to Rubik's Cubes. FIBA Daniel Tice went 1 for 10 from deep in the whole tournament, and dudes were still closing out to him so hard. It confused me so much in the Serbia game. His only basket, he shot faked a 3, dribbled between 2 defenders who closed out and hit a floater. I was like, he has made 1 3 the whole tournament. Why is he able to get away with this? Whatever. That is unrelated to this. So I had to do that first, the question, because for Jarace Walker, for me, the best case scenario would involve that role clarity becoming very obvious this year, right? He's either a good to great shooter right away, and it's clear that he's going to be that his whole career, and it's not just a one sample fluke, or he's a good shot creator, and like on the short roll, he can catch and make the right pass or something like that right away would be his best case scenario. And that would be the role clarity or the offensive skill set knowingness that the Pacers would like to have, because then they can build their team better. They know where he should be placed in lineups. They know where he'll slot in going forward. And the worst case is he looks subtractive on offense, right? He can't shoot very well. He can't make the decisions right away. He's not the best screener among the units that he's in. And then all of a sudden it's like, where do you put him? Where do you place him? Because that kind of player can lead to cross-matching issues like they've had in the past. And yeah, he's a good defender, but if he's really subtractive on offense, it's hard to slot those players in. So that kind of goes back to my question, but the scenarios range, I think, kind of depends on getting some clarity.
Yeah, because he and Jalen do have something in common in that, synergy is only tracking from Summer League possessions when you look at the roll man or ones that end in usage. It's not every pick that Jarace set. And there were times in those games where Jarace did set a pick, like if he was out there in the minutes when he was at the 5, and like he didn't really do anything after setting the pick. Like one of my biggest pet peeves is if you're going to slip a screen, then slip a screen. Like you actually have to put tension and move toward the basket. And sometimes Jalen can be a little bit like that too, where they'll just set the screen and then they kind of drift after that. You're not really putting pressure on the basket, or they just, they're gonna pop, but they don't fully pop in a way that's going to put pressure on the tagger or on the stunt defender. So that is going to be something to watch with Jarace. I do have a question for you that's related to this. Do you at all think that there's a chance that Jarace Walker might play some minutes at the 5 next year?
I think that's possible. Yes. I mean, especially if
so
the two backup bigs that are heading into year 3, 2.5, whatever of their time with the Pacers don't look like they're taking meaningful steps forward or look like long-term pieces, then yes, then even more so. Yes.
Because the one thing about playing Jarace at the 5 is you could potentially play Obi with Jarace out there in certain lineups. And if you play Jarace some minutes at the 5, it makes it easier to play Aaron Nesmith, I think. I think that opens up a cleaner path for that.
No, now all 3 backup centers are not.
And I don't know, I will say that in the game against OKC when he was out there at the 5 and he was defending Chet Holmgren and they were switching everything, the Pacers were getting crushed on both sides of the pick and roll during those minutes. Either Chet was slipping and then he just had a massive height advantage against Ben Shepherd or Isaiah Wong or whoever was guarding him in the paint. Although I do think that Ben Shepherd tried to swim the post pretty well. Or Jarace was getting beat out on the perimeter by step backs and other bigs out on the 3. But just overall in his technique and how quick his hands are, I'm not entirely sure that if they try to play like a switch everything lineup, that Jarace at the 5 won't be their best option. Just because after 2 years now of watching Isaiah Jackson try to do this, there's possessions where you can watch Isaiah and you really marvel at his ground coverage and his ability to shuffle. But then he wants to stand up. When he gets out to the perimeter against a guard, he wants to stand up, and then he ends up getting beat. And I don't think that Jarace is quite as prone to that aspect of it. So that's why I lean toward wondering if it isn't entirely outside of the possibility that he might find a way to get some minutes at the 5, despite the fact that there are already a lot of people on this roster who are 4/5, but aren't going to be playing the 4.
Contractually, 2 of them could not be on the team next year, though. If one of them is not, we'll talk about it. I think that is possible. And that's something I think if you're the Pacers, you want to know, right? Does this make sense? Does this fit with what we have stylistically? And then there's another, a lot of my questions for players that I could have put is just how do you fit without and with Tyrese Halliburton? And if you can play 2 positions and you can be a screener, that certainly ups the ways you can play with and without him. So that is a good addendum to that. And I'll be curious what that looks like. And I think that will the answer to that will depend more on the play of Jalen and Isaiah, more so than Jarace Walker himself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, and I think on the Tyrese front, 2 things that Jarace does is he does play defense. So having people out on the court that can play defense and insulate Tyrese Halliburton is helpful.
Yes.
And 2, I do think that there's real potential with, Miles setting an away screen up top for Jarace, getting the ball on a cut, and then doing a fake handoff to Tyrese Halliburton, and that could really confuse defenses in a way that they don't really have anybody on the roster who can do that right now. So I do think that could be a fit in lineups if they see transitional lineups if Jarace isn't a starter next year.
To start the season from a role perspective, I'm imagining Jarace Walker is a 4.
Yeah.
Gun to my head right now, backup 4. I don't know that. I haven't really dug into asking anybody, but my prediction would be right now that Obi Toppin starts at the 4 and Jarace Walker backs him up, and they play similar-ish minutes with maybe a little bit more going to Obi Toppin, which is fine to me. I think that makes sense, but the starting question to me is about fit with certain players and lineups and exploring what that looks like in the future, more so than does it add to your team this year? Because a lot of the questions the Pacers want to answer about Jarace Walker, they kind of also need to answer about Obi Toppin and his fit with their team this year in a different way. So exploring those lineups, I guess, makes sense. But my guess right now would be that he comes off the bench as the 4 for the first, I don't know how many games before they reassess. Last year was 27, I think, for Jalen Smith. So maybe about that many again.
Can I ask you a question, a numbers-based question about Jarace?
Oh, boy. Yes.
Okay, so which would you care more about with regards to Jarace? Him shooting 33% from 3 or him attempting more of his shots as layups than runners?
A second one, 100% the second one. Because the rim pressure would matter a lot more to me with him, especially because I think he can pass at his size, than being able to knock down threes, which threes are important. But if you can put pressure on the rim, you can add to any lineup at any time.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I'm looking at this question in a vacuum solely for Jarace's development, I would care to look up on Synergy at the end of the year and see that he got more shots at the rim in his layups than he attempted as runners. And then he started using, his physicality doesn't necessarily match his physique. There was even times during Summer League where he has lanes to get further to the basket, and he tends to rely on the stop and pop floater, which is going to be a lower percentage shot for him a lot of times. Like, that's what you want him to rely on as the counter. Like, if somebody doesn't come and tag up on him in the short roll, then it's great that he has this floater in his back pocket, but you want that to be the counter, not the go-to. But then on the flip side of that, like when I think about holistically in the roster, and especially if he were to find his way into the starting lineup next to Miles Turner, then I'm going to care about the three-point shot more. For the same reason I cared about the three-point shot more with Jalen Smith headed into last year and had questions like, if that's not hitting like it did for those 7 games when he couldn't miss, what happens to the overall health of the offense and to Miles? So that's kind of where I land with that particular question, but I wanted to get your thoughts.
Depending on how the season goes for Jalen Smith, I might do a whole podcast on those 7 games and what they meant for his career and the Pacers the last couple of years, because certainly very influential, and we will talk about him later today. So we'll see with Jarace in the role. I think there's good arguments to start him, truly, but in fact, if I were the decision maker, I think I would start him myself, but I get why Obi Toppin makes a lot of sense too, and I'm not going to degrade that decision any sort of way. Hey, everybody, short little break here so I can talk to you about Ibotta. It's officially the heart of summer, and a new season means you got to get new clothes, especially with fall coming up, but your closet shouldn't be the only thing growing when you make those purchases. Now you can also watch your cash back grow with each purchase with Ibotta. Ibotta gives you cash back on hundreds of grocery items, from produce to personal care to pantry goods, so you can make sure you're beating inflation no matter what you're purchasing. Either link your loyalty account or upload your receipt after you shop and get cash back. It's super easy. The average Ibotta user earns $120 per year. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip. Or use that cash back towards a flight you've been eyeing, a game you've been dying to go to, or a fancy dinner you've been craving. Other apps give you points that don't amount to much. With Ibotta, you get real cash back. You can cash out into your bank account, PayPal, or gift cards. You can earn that cash back on hundreds of online brands and retailers with Ibotta, including Lowe's, Macy's, Sephora, Best Buy, and more. Right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 just for trying it. Just hop on Ibotta, use the code LOCKED when you register. Boom, $5. Just go to the App Store or Google Play Store, download the free Ibotta app, and use the code LOCKED. That's IBOTTA in the Google Play or App Store, and use that promo code LOCKED. Speaking of Obi Toppin, Kaylin, you're up. Player number 2. Obi
and I feel like these two players are very much connected to each other for a number of reasons.
100%.
So I agree with you when I've been asked, like, who do you think will be the projected starting lineup for the Pacers next year? Like, if I had to say right now, I think that Obi Toppin most likely will start at the 4, mainly because of how the Pacers handled Benedict Mathurin last year. Now, I do think there's a difference between Benedict and Jarace, in that Jarace is a higher feel player than Jarace will be entering the NBA as a higher feel player than Ben was as a rookie last year, and that might help him get onto the court quicker. But the fact that they brought Ben along slowly and brought him off the bench leads me to think that they could potentially favor a similar trajectory with Jarace and Obi, and give Obi that nod to begin with.
Can I add one more thing to that?
Yeah, for sure.
So I agree, and I have said the same thing about Ben coming off the bench. My other point I've made is I think Obi specifically, his success will rely a lot more on playing with Tyrese than Jarace's will. And so pairing them in the starting 5 makes a lot more sense to me, at least to start the season.
And
so that's why I've said that.
This is a great segue. So thank you for adding that on there. This is tremendous, because I actually have a key stat here that I want to bring up as we're talking about the projected role and why we think that he will be starting. So I looked up, and for Obi Toppin's entire career, he has attempted 27 shots rolling to the basket. 27.
Wow.
because
it's probably hard to role play next to Taj Gibson and Mitchell Robinson, to be fair.
Exactly. Like he's always been out there with Nerlens or Mitchell Robinson or Taj Gibson. And like really the only time where he got opportunities to roll is if they were running a double drag and both bigs would roll. Like he and Mitchell Robinson would both roll, which looks incredibly quirky, but would sometimes confuse the defense a little bit. But even then, like he wasn't the player getting the touch. He was just rolling in tandem with Mitchell Robinson. So my projection here when I'm looking at that number is, I'll ask you, how many games into the season do you think it will take for Obi Toppin to have attempted 27 shots as the roll man?
Man, Turner's spacing is going to help him a ton in that way. Gosh,
do you think it'll happen by the end of November?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was going to say 10 games.
So I think it's going to happen by the end of November as well. And because we know what you just said before, we know what the impact is with Tyrese Haliburton in the pick and roll. We also know that you went over to Obi Toppin's camp in Dayton. I saw the quote where Obi had said that he had talked to Rick Carlisle about playing around the basket more. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that. Do you have more about that quote? Because I don't want to misrepresent what he said.
I mean, that's basically it. Because like, I think to him, it's he recognizes that it's what we already talked about. Like playing next, not only is he playing with Tyrese, who's the best passer he's ever played with, but the difference between him playing next to Miles Turner versus playing next to the bigs he played next to in New York, even playing next to Julius Randle, is way different for what the space it will allow him to have and the rim pressure will allow him to execute.
Yeah, because I mean, you can put Taj Gibson in the corner, but people aren't going to care if Taj Gibson is standing in the corner. And with Julius Randle, it's kind of like when Miles Turner would be playing with Sabonis. Like there just isn't a very valid reason to take possessions out of Julius Randle's hands to net that over to Obi. So yeah, I think that he's going to hit that mark by the end of November. And the reason I bring this up is like, let's now look at this from the other side. If he hits that mark by the end of November, what does that mean for Miles Turner, Tony? If Obi Toppin has rolled to the basket enough to have surpassed his career mark in roll possessions that he was at with the New York Knicks, what do you think that has meant for Miles Turner's roll by the end of November?
It looks a little more like it did 2 years ago than last year, probably.
I think it might look like it did last year. No, because he'll be rolling instead of just spacing to the corner like Jalen, but that's the point. Like, yeah, I think it'll be more of Miles Turner standing on the perimeter. And potentially Miles Turner being defended by fours.
That is possible. You've created quite the conundrum in my head that I had not considered.
Another stat that I will add in conjunction with this is that over the last 2 years when Miles Turner is defended by centers, he shoots 40% from three. When he's defended by forwards, he shoots 31% from three.
So my follow-up would be then that Obi's three-point shooting might be more important than I thought, and the fact that he showed some growth there last year could be important for him being guarded by fives and him shooting over them in the same way that Turner's was or is.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, if Obi can maintain some of what he was doing, because I do think he was a quicker trigger shooter. I mean, there was times in that series against the Heat where it was telling. Because somebody in my mailbag asked a question and was like, do you think that Tyrese and Obi could have a similar pick and roll partnership as Steve Nash and Amari Stoudemire? And I was like, okay, well, that's one of the best pick and roll combinations of all time, number one. But two, like, I understand that like Obi's athleticism and ability to go catch anything and Tyrese has a lot of nuance in the pick and roll, but like there was possessions in that series against the Heat that were telling because Obi was being defended for the majority of that series by Duncan Robinson and Max Strus. So it was like Obi was being used, go set a screen for Jalen Brunson so Jalen Brunson can get the worst defender in space. Jalen's going to try to cook in space, and then Obi would just go run off of Mitchell Robinson like an exit screen and have to shoot really quick. And to his credit, he did what they asked him to do. And there was games where he hit multiple threes, and that's great. But like I do think it's going to matter that he'd be able to shoot to a degree, or it's going to be, for Miles' sake, it's going to be similar to what has been in the past. And that I think that Miles showed last year that he needs to be a five defended by fives. So it's kind of like the similar thing with Jarace. Like I do think it's beneficial because I think that there's more things that Obi and Jarace can do than what was the case last year with Jalen. Like you can't do as many different things with Jalen when fives are defending him as you can do with these two. But I still think it could have a somewhat marginalizing effect on Miles to begin the season, depending upon how they're used.
So another skill here could be, can Obi Toppin just beat these guys off the dribble in some capacity? Because then you can't put as many fives on him, right? And then you flipped it back. But there's a lot of you used this term last year, and now it's stuck in my brain for forever. Fact finding. Like, there's a lot of fact finding with Obi Toppin for me, which is interesting because he's been in the NBA for 3 years, but his situation has been not so bad, but pretty bad for him in a way that, like, I kind of don't know what he can be for this team.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it's projection, especially defensively, because he's going to be doing much different things in Indiana, I would presume, than what he was doing with the Knicks. Like I said, whenever they signed him, he switched on like 18% of screens last year. Like, it just wasn't a factor. And like Aaron Nesmith at the 4 switched on almost 80%. Jalen Smith, even when he played at the 4, was switching on like 35%. So what he can do in space on switches is going to be rather informative. So this actually brings me to my one big question about Obi Toppin's season, which is, I think it's pretty clear that Obi Toppin will build out their biggest strength, which is what they do in transition. There's no doubt in my mind that he's going to fit Tyrese Halliburton in their ability to run off of off of misses, especially with him leaking out. My question is, what does he do that will address any of their weaknesses? Will he do anything that addresses any of their weaknesses? What does he look like when he's switching at the 4? What will the balance be between him leaking out in transition and them securing defensive rebounds? Can he provide something in the form of secondary rim protection at the 4 spot? Those are, I feel, the big questions for Obi Toppin. Can he do anything that they were weak at last year?
Also, you have to get a stop or a rebound to get into transition in the first place. So if he's subtractive on defense, they can't do the thing that they're so excited about as often, right?
I mean, they did it a lot last year, and they weren't getting stops or rebounds. They were the worst rebounding team in the NBA.
That is true.
25th in defense.
You know what's funny is, like, a very subtle thing I noticed. I don't know if there's like a stat to track this, and you love research projects where you come up with the stat. I think when the Pacers were playing their worst last year is the games where they had the fewest times where they would sprint into the crowd to grab a loose ball to, like, get transition going after a turnover from the other team.
Probably so, because it slowed them down.
Yes, I don't know if that's a real thing or not.
I mean, they ranked second in the NBA last year in time to shoot after a made shot, because they run off of makes very well. That's Tyrese and the hit aheads, and
that is one of Buddy Hield's best NBA skills that no one talks about. He will sprint into the third row to get the dang ball and get a transition opportunity started. Yeah, that's a good point, right? Because a lot of the talk about Obi has been he adds to what they're good at. And that's good. Like, pushing towards that is good. That will make him fit well. And Tyrese is excited about that. After watching them in a pro-am together, I certainly hope they don't play that way during the NBA season all the time. But how can he correct their weaknesses, especially on the defensive end, will be telling. And I think his size will help with some of that stuff. Like, they just have, outside of O'Shea Brissett, they had no 4s with any sort of typical 4 size last season until they got Jordan Nwora in February. So I think that will help, but I'm certainly not the highest on his defense among the people who view the Pacers often, I would say.
Yeah, there's times where he can really use his length to his advantage. Like, I found possessions when they were playing Cleveland, for instance, where he switched out to Karis LeVert and was able to get stops, and then did the whole thing where if you're a 4-man and you contest on a switch, you just automatically keep running on the closeout. And that's kind of the thing. Like, you could do that with the Knicks because the Knicks have strong rebounders at the wing spot with RJ Barrett and Josh Hart, and you have Mitchell Robinson. They ranked like 12th in opponent offensive rebounding rate. That translates a little bit differently when it's like Tyrese rebounding on the weak side, though he did have some decent moments in FIBA defending and boxing out up a position, and when it's Miles. So that's going to certainly be part of it. I do think that Obi had some decent showings in the playoffs. I think that something that's kind of sticking in my head, though, is like this general archetype, and I'm painting in really broad strokes here, of, kind of being pigeonholed into the 4 if you don't necessarily protect the rim and you don't necessarily aren't a wing stopper and you're more of, an offensive player at the 4 spot. Like, what we're seeing, how much the league values those guys currently. Like what John Collins just got traded to for the Utah Jazz, what Christian Wood just signed to for the Lakers.
You don't want Rudy Gay, a 2nd-round pick on the Pacers?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, how much does the league value that archetype at the 4 spot in the playoffs is kind of what I'm looking at with regards to Obi Toppin, because what Jarace tracks at, it seems like the league values a lot at the 4 spot in the playoffs, kind of even regardless of whether Jarace makes shots or not. Like what we just saw Aaron Gordon do in the NBA Finals as a finishing 5th piece when he gets to slide into that role, provide secondary rim protection, be somebody who can guard at multiple spots. Like, it seems like that's kind of where the league is trending, but I haven't seen Obi. Like we said, it's a lot of projection. I don't fully know defensively what he can do yet. There's times where he's very active as an off-ball defender, but that can sometimes be a blessing and a curse. He can be very active, and then sometimes it's like, why are you tagging there? Like, Hartenstein's already in the dunker spot. Like, stay on the corner. You don't need to be helping. Like, he can be a little bit hyperactive. So I'm very curious to see what his defense looks like and if it can be helpful to the Pacers, just for the reason you said, just that they have a bigger body out on the court at the same time as Miles.
His rebound rate was below 10% last year, and when some of that was that he runs, like he wasn't crashing the glass, but at the same time, like 10% is like if every player got the same number. Like if you're 6'9", you should be above 10% rebound rate, basically on any team to me. So that I think will have to be better. It was above that his first 2 years in the league, but just barely. So I think that's gonna have to be better. But at the same time, his skill is running the floor and being in open space and doing the Obi Toppin stuff. So I'll be curious what that looks like too. Have you done scenarios? That is our last thing, correct?
I think that the best case scenario is the one that we need to talk about the most, because let's just say Obi Toppin starts. His numbers look closer to what they've looked like when he's been a starter for the Knicks. He produces when he plays. He makes it look silly that the Knicks traded him for pocket lint. He's the breakout candidate people think he's going to be. What does that mean for Jarace Walker at the end of the year? And what does that mean for Miles Turner at the end of the year? Those are like my big questions. Like, it would be great if that's what happens for Obi Toppin. Obviously, you're acquiring him with some sort of inclination that is what's going to happen for him. And it was very low risk for the Pacers to do so. It's just that, like, you just drafted Jarace at that spot. And is it going to be similar, though not exactly the same, to what Obi was experiencing in New York? That Julius Randle was there. They drafted him at number 8. Julius Randle was there. There was never really an opportunity for him to ascend into being a starter. He was hard capped. And some of that's because, Tom Thibodeau wants to play with a big man on the court at all times in a way that, may not happen here for the Pacers. And Jarace will play. Like, he's going to play off the bench, we assume. But it just creates an interesting dynamic that if he comes over and does what you're really hoping he's going to do, what does that do to the player that you just drafted?
Can I add one more thing to that?
Sure.
What does that do for Obi Toppin next year? For those not watching on YouTube, I am pretending to hold money in my hand because he's a restricted free agent next year. And that would also create another conundrum to me because of Jarace Walker and Miles Turner being under contract and their backup big situation. And just how does this all work for them from a long-term planning perspective? And if his best case scenario is that best case scenario, then we have to go back to what we just talked about with Jarace Walker maybe playing the 5, and you have lots of those on your team, one of them being Miles Turner right now. So that's interesting that his best case scenario does kind of overlap with some of the stuff they already established or some of the stuff they already did. To me, I think the price was just so low that you are okay with that, over those overlapping goals potentially happening, and you deal with it later because you didn't give up anything for that to happen. And the best case scenario is still better than not having him at that price to me. Obviously.
Are we both on the same page that we think there's no way that they're going to sign him to an extension before?
0% chance.
Okay.
He hasn't played a game for them. You have no idea what he can be.
That's what I think too, but just wanted to make sure we were on the same page.
I think
there.
There's like a small chance for Aaron Nesmith, I guess, although he's not like middling players very rarely I know you know this, but it just very rarely happens because they'd rather just bet on themselves. Like what Nasser Little did last year never happens. That's super rare. So I don't think Nesmith will either, but Toppin, I think there's just zero chance because I don't even know what he looks like with their team.
And it just seems like for his sake, knowing that he's going to a more favorable environment, that it would be to his benefit to wait as well too. But we shall.
And if you're the Pacers and he's awesome, you're like, great, we'll happily pay you then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Worst case scenario.
I didn't even really develop in one. I mean, I don't think there really is a worst case when you think about it. I mean, they gave up 2 second-round picks. If he comes over and he doesn't hit, you've already drafted Jarace. Like, yeah. I don't really see too much of a downside in the acquiring of Obi Toppin here.
Yeah, and they maybe Warwick can just step in and play. Like their worst case scenario isn't super drastic for anything long term, especially too because he's a free agent next year anyway. So there's not like any sunk cost error.
I mean, they can play Aaron Nesmith at backup 4 as well. I mean, he played 4 last year. So
the true worst case scenario is something like, okay, in 2027, they're the worst team in the NBA, and who's the other side of that swap? The Suns are the best team in the NBA. So they give up 29 picks of second round equity. And then in 2029, they're again the worst team in the NBA, and the Wizards are the best team in the NBA. So that they lost several second round equity slots for an Obi Toppin year that did not go well, right? That is in theory the worst case scenario. Are you going to bet on the Wizards being the best team in the NBA ever?
No, I'm thinking probably not, but sorry, Wizards.
I have my Wizards mug, but you can't see it because of my desk setup and my coffee stand. It's actually behind my giant Mad Ants blanket. Yeah, I think that like anything subtractive is just part of the worst case scenario to me. Like if it makes every other player's life harder, because then it's harder to assess what they are too. And while the Pacers want to be good this year, they're still young enough to me that there is still some discovery and fact finding to do. So if he is subtractive, especially on defense, I'll be curious what that actually means for them long term.
My only thing is if he is truly subtractive, like let's pretend that the math doesn't shake out, that they're playing a starting lineup with Ben and Bruce and Obi, and the spacing is so much different than last year, and they haven't made enough steps forward defensively. I just don't think they're going to keep playing that lineup.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That like last year with Jalen Smith.
Yeah, I mean, if they were willing to back off of that after they sat at a table and they were like, "Hey, this guy is a real power forward, and he's the power forward of the future," and then by beginning of December they've pivoted off of that, I just think that they would make a change and they wouldn't continue starting or playing Obi if it was that detrimental.
We nailed another segue. Let's talk about Jalen Smith as our final player of the day. We had to have someone be the third power forward. And if this was a year ago, I might have done Isaiah Jackson here, given the Pacers said after they drafted him, we think he could play the 4. And then they did that for about, 17 minutes alongside Miles Turner. So I think they think of him more as a 5 now. But Jalen Smith started at the 4 for several games, so he gets the nod, even though I don't view either of them as 4s as much as I used to for either player. Interesting year ahead for Jalen Smith because I don't really know what to make of him right now. He said after they played in Cleveland, I'll never forget it. It was the game they got eliminated from playoff contention. So I think April 1st or 2nd. And we were talking to him in the locker room, and he was kind enough to do media after a game like that. When you get eliminated, no one's in a good mood. And he said, I shot the ball and then cussed this season, right? Like he knew it. He was painfully aware of it because I think he knows that the shooting is important to him and his projection, and that I forget how many games. You said 7, right? It was 7 games where after the trade, he just could not miss. And he said that too in that quote. He said, I dang near couldn't miss last year. And now that's not the case. And that really has kind of changed what his situation is with the Pacers, because that was part of his issue in Phoenix, is like his offensive skills there weren't very many of them that could keep him on the floor, even though he was a good rebounder and better rim protector than he gets credit for. That wasn't enough to overcome his offensive struggles. And so I think I think I'll start there with a question. No, I won't. I think that is part of my projection for the season for him, thinking about it, is the 3-pointer, because of the cross-matching stuff we've talked about, because of who the backup 5 can actually be next to Jarace Walker, right? The shooting is not like the end-all be-all for him, but it's very important this season given what the team has done.
Can I just put into context what exactly his shooting was last year for people who are listening? There was 169 players who attempted at least 150 catch and shoot threes last year, and he had the worst conversion rate at 27.7%. Ben wasn't too far off. He was like 5th to last, but Jalen had the worst conversion rate. And I won't forget that like they were playing the Pistons in that last end of, the season kind of head there up in Detroit. You were there. And Jalen Duren's defending at the 5. And I was like, yeah, this is a really big statement on what this game is, because both teams are like playing rebuilding rosters. And a couple times in that game, Duren bit on pump fakes from Jalen Smith out above the break, catch and shoot threes. And I was just like, what are we doing here? Like, how is this a thing that we're watching? And part of the problem with Jalen is like, you don't really know right now what the better option is for him, a catch and shoot 3 or a catch and drive, because neither usually ends in very good results. And that's kind of the problem that he finds himself in, and why it was very clear that he wasn't going to be able to be a starting power forward next to Miles Turner. Now, I do think he had some better moments at the 5 last year. Like, I remember very vividly that game before the All-Star break when they played the Bulls and he came in for like a brief stretch. That kind of turned that game a little bit. Like, he was very active on the glass. He was very good scramming out the mismatches because they had put Nesmith on Vucevic at that point. And this is where I think it's interesting, because you and I both kind of seem to have the same opinion a little bit about like what's going to be good for Jarace at the backup 4 spot. It might in fact be Jalen, just because he is at least willing to step out and shoot the threes. You can at least have him stand out on the perimeter, even if he isn't necessarily being guarded like he's a shooter. Just the fact that he's not being positioned in the dunker spot might give Jarace more room to stretch his legs and experiment with what exactly he is at the NBA level. On the flip side of that, Andrew Nembhard and Isaiah Jackson have had very good chemistry in the pick and roll. And this is reflected in the numbers as well. They scored over a point per possession on direct picks with Isaiah Jackson as the screener. Those numbers were like 0.797 points per direct when Jalen Smith was the screener for Andrew Nembhard. Like Andrew and Ijax didn't even play that many minutes together, and they were like close to leading the league in alley-oop combinations. Now, in part, that's because Isaiah is, mostly a lob threat, but still, like Andrew actually assisted Isaiah more at the rim than Tyrese last year, and he didn't play that many more minutes with Isaiah than Tyrese did. So it's a question of, do you value Andrew and letting him play out of ball screens if he is going to be your backup point guard, or do you value getting more out of Jarace and how I would envision that backup 5 position, unless you just want to be like, hey, we just watched Daniel Theis win gold for Germany, and if we want to be a playoff team, like in all honesty, if they want to be a playoff team, Daniel Theis is better than Jalen and Isaiah Jackson right now. Whether he can play in a high-paced scheme,
I was going to say, but I talked about this yesterday, and I heard you talk about it on Dunked On. There is a whole fit element to him that is not the case with Germany of the speed of the team.
Exactly. And Jalen and Isaiah play better in an up-tempo scheme than I'm guessing that Daniel's going to be able to handle. But I do think that he's ahead of them in terms of overall dependability as a big and what else you can do with him. But that's kind of the dynamic that I look for with Jalen Smith. Like if it was just me thinking about developing Jarace, I would probably lean toward Jalen. But if it's about everything else, then I might lean toward Isaiah. And I guess some of it depends too on which one of those two backup bigs. Like, are you confident in either of their upsides, just them in and of themselves? Because if you think one of them's significantly ahead of the other, then that should dictate your decision. I don't know that I necessarily do. I don't think that there's a clear winner there. So my decision's probably going to be based more on what I think the overall fit with that second unit is.
Can I ask you a follow-up to your fit question?
Yeah.
I agree with you. You said that already, that the Jalen being willing to shoot matters for his fit with Jarace on offense. But Isaiah is a much better switch defender than Jalen Smith is on the defense.
Is he though? I don't know about that.
Interesting. I think
I'm in year 2, and I don't know what Isaiah's ideal pick and roll coverage is. When he's in drop, his positioning still needs a lot of work. The numbers support Jalen far more in drop than they do Isaiah. And switching wise, like Isaiah can do it. And like I said, there's moments where he can be very proactive with his feet, or he can slide with a ball handler, sideline to sideline. He did that against Fred VanVleet on a possession up in Toronto, but there's other times where he goes out there and his tendency is he wants to stand up and then he gets beat. He doesn't always take the best angles. So in theory, yes. In the long term, Isaiah would be a better switch defender than Jalen. I don't know that it's necessarily there right now. Like the numbers with Isaiah at the 5 defensively are not good for the Pacers.
Not good.
Like all of their numbers are bad defensively, but it's not reflecting well of Isaiah right now.
Because I was curious if you thought anything of the Jarace Isaiah just switch everything as an option. That would not be as much the case if Jalen was in there. But if you don't think as highly of Isaiah switching, then you definitely would opt for Jalen for fair reasons.
I think if you have Jarace defending 5s and switching out to the ball, I like the idea of Isaiah as a weak side, ferocious rim protector. I mean, if I had to do a count of where his blocks came from last year, like in the game against Atlanta, for instance, when I think he had like 7 blocks, I think the majority of those were with him rotating to the rim rather than swallowing up actions that were coming with him already at the rim. Like, I think a lot of times he kind of tends to be a little bit better when he's unleashed in kind of that weak side rim protector role, but he still has a lot that he needs to learn on that end of the floor.
So, that'll be interesting to see how they view those fit questions, if that is their tiebreaker. And you actually nailed my question with something you just said, which is, are they significantly higher on one or the other? Because my Jalen Smith question for this season is hardly about Jalen Smith. It is, what do the Pacers think of you? Right? Last year, we knew exactly what the Pacers thought of Jalen Smith. They did everything they could to keep him. Player option, starting job. We love this kid. We love developing him. He was great for us. Holy cow, we got lucky with this trade. Let's make this happen. And then after a third of the season, they were like, okay, let's switch this up. What do they think of him right now? He does everything they ask. By all accounts, great off-the-court presence, good learner, listens to what is said, tries to apply it in game. What do they actually think of him going into this season? Do they think he has a chance to be their long-term backup 5? Do they think Isaiah Jackson has a better chance of that? Do they think Jalen Smith has any prayer of playing the 4 anymore? If so, I have a lot of other questions, right? What do they think of Jalen Smith is going to dictate how much he plays, with whom he plays, what his role is, what he's asked to do? And I really don't know what they think of him, given how his season went last year, where he went from starter to bench guy to not playing to playing to not playing. And I could do the oscillating graph for forever after how they handled the last couple months of the season. So I think a lot of how his season could go is, what does the team think of him right now?
I think the biggest context clue for that is what they did after he was no longer the starting 4 and they knew they were going to be playing him at the 5. When they were making a choice, Jalen Smith was the backup 5 and Isaiah Jackson was out of the rotation. Until optics-wise, it looks pretty bad, especially in the aftermath of waiving Goga to create roster spots for Isaiah Jackson to effectively be the new Goga Batadze. This guy that you have drafted and invested to the fact that they did move up to go get Isaiah, and now there's no room for him to even play, and he's your third string big, and then eventually they ended up going to the rotation, carousel, where they're each getting a night on, night off. It leads me to think that they would favor Jalen, and if I were being honest, like right here, right now, if I was just if contracts and nothing else mattered and anything else, and I'm just comparing head to head, I would probably lean towards Jalen, just because he gives you a little bit more flexibility, and I do think he's ahead positioning-wise. But if you like the idea that you have more team control, given that you drafted Isaiah Jackson, if you really like his fit with Andrew Nemhard, if you still believe in what he could do defensively as a switch big for you, then you lean toward Isaiah. But if it's just about winning games right here in the here and now, I would pick Jalen.
Yeah, that'll be fascinating to see what they think of him and how they decide that. And that might be my most interesting camp competition, because there's going to be a lot of them, but I think most of them are like who's playing more or less. And this one is who's playing at all. And the other portion is just not, at least presumably. We'll see. I guess McConnell could be sort of in a similar situation.
Yeah. I have a fun question for you.
Okay.
The year is 2024.
Oh boy.
We're headed to media day.
So a year from now. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're headed to media day.
Yeah.
Who is the backup 5 for the Indiana Pacers?
Who's a minimum free agent next year? I mean, that could be the answer. I'm not even kidding that much.
I'm not entirely sure that won't be the answer. And I'm also not entirely sure that the answer won't be Jarace Walker.
I was going to say, I think my most likely answer on the roster right now, to serve the purpose of your question, might be Jarace Walker. Yes. Mm-hmm. And it might be Jarace Walker starts at the 4 and is your backup 5 at the same time.
No, I don't think that the Pistons are going to do this, but similarly to how I would view Isaiah Stewart. My guess is he will probably start at the 4 next to Jalen Duren. And then if it were me and I was coaching the Pistons, I would move Isaiah Stewart to backup 5 after he's played some minutes at the 4 and let him be a switch big.
I have a lot of questions about the Pistons front court rotation that we don't need to get into. Right?
Don't we all?
They had quite the summer. Let's say that. So funnily enough, you mentioned something contractually, and in theory, with the question you just asked, kind of brought it up. The best case scenario for Jalen Smith to me is the shooting recovers to like a credible point, like 35, 36%, because then his fit with Jarace is great. He'd clearly be your backup 5 at that point. Also, because if his shooting is good again, you don't have to change as much stylistically from your first or second units with Turner and him. And there's some elements of switch defense improvement. That would be in my best case scenario. But let me add in a tiny little third point to this. Both of those things happen, and Jalen Smith is really happy in Indiana with both of those things happening. And he's going to opt into that player option because he doesn't quite outplay it despite both of those things happening. That would probably be the best case scenario for the Pacers.
Yeah, I mean, and if that did happen, because like what you just said there, like if his shot gets back to being like more credible, like, and this will be for another episode, but if you're not moving TJ McConnell to third string point guard and like TJ and Andrew are going to be playing together off the bench, like if you have TJ and Jarace and Isaiah out there all at the same time, that's going to be a little bit cramped. So it would be nice if Jalen's 3 could fall at a,
It needs to fall just enough that no team wants to offer more than $5.5 million. That is the actual best case scenario for someone like Jalen Smith, because then he'd have 1.5, I guess, seasons of like, oh, maybe this guy can shoot, and teams value that, especially from reserve bigs. I'm trying to think if there's a good comp of a reserve big who can shoot a little, who got money this summer, but I'm having a little trouble. Either way, I think that would be an interesting factor there. Worst case scenario, the shot confirmed this year is totally fake, and he's just an awful fit with Jarace Walker and doesn't look like a piece with this team. And guess what? If that happened, he's definitely opting in next year. So then you have his money on your books, and you have his money on your books, and he's not your fit at backup 5, which goes back to the question you just asked me about 2024 media day. Like, I hate that so much of this comes down to his shot, but if they're going to opt for a fit with Jarace as part of their consideration, then the shot's really important.
Yeah. And true. I mean, some of it too is that like Jarace has more of a handle. Like we said, like there's other things that I can look at between Obi and Jarace and be like, okay, if the shot doesn't fall, you could potentially do this with him. When the shot doesn't fall with Jalen, he can do some as the screener. But like I said, there's times where I just want him to be more forceful with what he does. And it's like, okay, what do you do now? Like, that's where it gets more challenging.
What exactly do you do here?
I mean, there are occasions where one thing I will say that Jalen is really good at is that he runs the floor really hard in transition, and he'll do early work. More so than probably the rest of the bigs on the roster, where he'll do early work, look for a cross match, and then sometimes he will be physical if he has one on the block, and he'll catch a hit-ahead pass and do something with it. So that is another element of his game that we probably should have mentioned.
Jalen Smith's role, Caitlin. I typed a bunch of question marks. In theory, the answer is backup 5 or nothing, right? Because he can't. There's no spot at the 4 anymore, so he's either the backup 5 or he's not playing at all. And I don't think there's a lot of more nuance to that. I think the nuance is more so if he is the backup 5, what is the fit like? And that has less to do with his role and more about the projection stuff that we talked about for the season. But there's no more facade of him being a 4 or playing next to another big. I think that all went away.
And if he's the backup 5 or not playing at all, and he's not playing at all, how many backup 5s will not be not playing at all before you move one of them?
How many years have I covered the Pacers? And I think every single one, the center rotation or the center combos has been a top 3 to 5 storyline for the team. Probably all of them except.
And the funny thing is nothing happens with them until something absolutely has to happen with it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, oh, it's a storyline. There's
Turner, they got
2 starting bigs, and there is also Goga, and there's also like finally just Goga just gets waived, and you get Jordan Wara. Like, it's like there was a lot of talking about this for nothing to really ever happen.
I think we learned the answer to Goga's trade value last year. And hey, that will possibly be relevant depending on how much Jalen Smith and Isaiah Jackson play well during this coming season. Turns out being a mid to late first round pick center who doesn't play at all, you have no trade value. You just don't. So,
but now when you make trade calls, you dial up. Hey, did you just see that Daniel Theis won gold for Germany?
No, you have to say it in German. I don't know how you do that, but
Ich verstehe ein bisschen Deutsch. I know a little bit of German.
Whoa.
Yep.
I was not expecting that.
I was tempted to pull that out when I talked to Daniel Theis the last time, but then I was like really embarrassed. I'm like, what if my pronunciation is poor?
I had to use Google Translate in my last article about Daniel Theis because he tweeted world champs after the game in German, and I was like, I'm pretty sure I know what this is, but let me guess. The problem is, he put a space between all the letters, so I had to type it myself, and I spelled it wrong.
What was it, like Welton? I don't know what the German word for champ is. Can't think of it.
I have to read it without the spaces in my head. Weltmeister?
Oh yeah, Weltmeister. For sure.
Is that right? Is it Welt? Because the W is
Weltmeister. Yeah.
Weltmeister? I just heard I don't know. We're off the rails here. I have nothing else to add about Jalen Smith. If you have anything else to add, either in German or English. Brian Windhorst was just talking about how he's German and technically his last name should be Windhorst. And I was like, that's really
true.
Pissed me off.
I was very embarrassed because there's a clip of me out on the internet when I was doing a Raptors podcast earlier this summer, and we were talking about Dennis Schroeder. And I said Schroeder twice, and I was like, that's embarrassing. It's not Dennis Schroeder.
What's that called?
Schroeder, umlaut.
Umlaut? I was going to say that, but I didn't want to be wrong. So I just said nothing.
Yep.
That's a tip to anyone on the internet. If you're not sure, just don't say anything.
I know, because now there's a clip of me out on the internet being an ugly American who doesn't know how to pronounce something.
Dennis. Call him Dennis. I don't know if you know him like
Even
that.
Worse, I take multiple years of a foreign language, and that's what I have to show for it. Clip of me mispronouncing a German name.
The only Spanish player the Pacers had was Ricky Rubio. I took a lot of Spanish, but Rubio's pretty easy. So
Chris Duarte. I mean, I guess he's not Spanish, but
yeah, I was gonna say
he
is a little different. And yes, he spoke a lot of Spanish. Sabonis spoke Spanish.
You could have broke out your Spanish with Sabonis.
I could. I actually was helpful for those because I could understand when in the pressers when they would change language. I was like, oh, I at least know what was asked. I don't know the specifics because it was too fast for me, but at least I'm not like completely lost right now. Also, that's so impressive that they can just do that.
Oh
like,
yeah, for sure.
Laser thinking about the game and the subject matter, they could just switch languages. I'm always like, how did you do that?
I mean, think about that. You just said world champs, and I didn't know the word for champs in German, and I took multiple years of that language.
Shout out to that Germany team. Their role players are perfect. I know that we're not here to talk about that, but like all of them are just exactly what they
Schroeder, Obst, and Tice are pretty much Steph, Clay, and Draymond.
I said this after Eurobasket last year. I think Johannes Voigtman could play in the NBA. He's just tough as hell.
I'm confident that several players on rosters at the World Championships could probably play in the NBA.
It was wild how many teams would play and they'd put a guy in there, like the Serbia-Germany game. They put in Marko Guduric, and I was like, oh yeah, he was on the Grizzlies that one time, I think. Like, I forget about all these guys and then they play in the World Cup, and I'm like, oh yeah, that guy. Like Serbia had, I think, 4 or 5 of those. Molatinov got drafted at one point. We have totally fallen off the rails here. We'll do another one of these later this week on the shooting guards. A little more concrete who actually falls into the shooting guard categories. That one will be the Bens, Mr. Mather and Mr. Shepard, as well as Buddy Hield. I suppose you could squint and put Bruce Brown there, but he'll be in our threes group. And we'll do one of these for each positional group, not counting the two-way players who will be playing for the Indiana Mad Ants. I just said that out loud for the first time of my life. Caitlin, of course, thank you for the time. As always, please tell everybody where they can find your work on Patreon covering this Pacers team. And recently, the play-in tournament, some Team USA stuff, more about the Pacers, but about other stuff as well.
Right. So if people are watching on YouTube, my Twitter handle is listed here. It is at C2_Cooper. You can go to my Twitter handle. Then you'll be able to find the link to Patreon, which is patreon.com/basketballshero. Yeah, I did a lot of products in August that were very tedious. So I appreciate everyone who is a patron and supporting me to do that. Most recently, Evan Gualberto and I, a friend of mine who coaches at a very high level of basketball and has a lot of subscribers on YouTube, helped me put together something on all of Tyrese's hit-ahead passes from last season and really breaking down how he's able to process those so quickly and also schematically what teams do in transition. Because sometimes I think that we just look at it and just assume guys are running really hard down the floor and that there's not a lot of strategy there, but there is, and how that triggers dominoes. So that's up. And then I'll be doing this whole series. Recently, I also have a link posted there. I did the preview pod with Nate Duncan, and I did a Central Division preview with Danny LaRue too. So lots of podcasts have been recorded in the last week or so. It feels like
it's that time. It's that time where people are really diving into the season. And Nate made that a free one. So
that was very nice of him. Everybody can climb the paywall. I mean, you don't even have to climb the paywall.
Subscribe, or you can listen to Caitlin on the Pacers on Dunked On. That was so good. I love the way Nate structures those with the big questions. Yes, highly recommend. I am a paid patron over at Basketball Shero, and I recommend you do the same. Tomorrow, Dustin Dopirak makes his second Locked On Pacers appearance. I've let him chill too much in the breeze. I've got to talk to him more on podcast settings. We're doing storylines coming up for the Pacers this season. I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot about Ben Mather, but in general, the biggest stuff to watch heading into this Pacers season. Really excited to chat with Dustin. It's been a while. And later this week, another episode with Caitlin. And Thursday, we'll see. There's a chance the player interview that was messed up from last month is resurrected. I doubt it, but we'll see. So TBD on the topic of Thursday. Thank you all for listening today. We'll see you soon.